You are fighting battles that you don't even know exist. While you sleep, while you work, while you think everything is under control, an invisible war is going on around you. And here's the most disturbing thing: angels are fighting for you right now. But why? Why are there days when everything freezes? Why, even if you do the right thing, does it feel like something is against you? Why do certain thoughts appear out of nowhere as if they weren't yours? What if I told you that this is no coincidence? In this video, you will understand how the spiritual battlefield that the Bible reveals works, how the angels go to war because of you, and most importantly, how your actions activate or block these invisible battles. The question is, which side is this war being won in your life? Most people believe that their life is defined only by what they can see: work, money, relationships, decisions. But there is a dimension that few can understand, and it is exactly there that the most decisive battles of your life take place. Have you ever felt like you were doing everything right, but still everything goes wrong? Have you ever felt an inexplicable weight, a sudden demotivation, thoughts that just come without warning, like something is trying to stop you? Now think with me. What if this isn't just emotional? What if this is spiritual? The Bible reveals something that almost no one fully understands. There is a constant conflict going on around you, a conflict between forces you cannot see, but they directly influence every area of your life. And here is the most important point. You are not just a spectator of this war. You are the territory, your mind, your decisions, your faith. All of this is at the center of an invisible battlefield. And while you ignore it, there are angels being sent, battling, resisting because of you. But there are also forces trying to confuse you, slow you down, weaken you. The big question is, why do some people seem to advance spiritually with ease, while others live trapped even though they try? The answer lies in something that few see: the rules of this spiritual battlefield. And that's exactly what you'll discover now. In the next few minutes, you will understand how this invisible system works, how angels really act in these battles, and what are you, perhaps without realizing it, doing that directly interferes with this conflict. But be careful. Once you understand this, you will never see your problems the same way again. Now, to understand all this, we need to start at the beginning. What's really going on behind the world you see? To understand how angels fight battles you can't see, you first need to shatter a very common illusion. The illusion that the visible world is all that exists. This is the first trap, because when a person believes that there is only what the eyes see, they interpret spiritual wars as if they were just bad phases, tiredness, bad luck, coincidence, or emotional weakness. But the Bible does not present reality that way. The Bible shows from beginning to end that there is an invisible world in constant activity, not stopped, not far, not just symbolic, active around you. Now, when the prophet Elisha was surrounded by an enemy army, his servant fell into despair. In human eyes, defeat was certain. The scene was closed. There was no way out. But Elisha prayed a simple and powerful prayer for the boy's eyes to be opened. And when this happened, he saw that the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire around Elisha. Do you see what this reveals? The invisible world was already there before it was perceived. God's protection did not begin when the servant saw. It already existed. This changes everything, because you often think you're alone just because you can't see what's happening around you. But invisible does not mean non-existent. This is a lot of people's mistake. They only believe in battle when the pain is evident. They only believe in attack when the problem explodes. They only believe in divine intervention when something supernatural happens in a visible way. But the spiritual operates first in the invisible. First in the invisible, then in the visible. It's like a war of intelligence before a war of arms. Before the explosion, there is strategy. Before the open confrontation, there is movement. Before a fortress falls, there is a siege. The spiritual world works like this. There is a constant movement that precedes what you feel, decide, and experience. That is why certain oppressions seem to appear out of nowhere. But they didn't come from nowhere. They came from an invisible environment that was already being contested. And here's a truth that few people understand. The center of this dispute is often not your body, nor your money, nor your relationships. It's your position, spiritual tie-in. The enemy doesn't just want to hurt you. He wants to get you out of alignment. It wants to weaken your faith. It wants to distort your perception. You want to tire your soul. It wants to make you react in the flesh to what began in the spirit. Because when you lose discernment, you fight the wrong way. And that is devastating. You start fighting people when the origin of the conflict is spiritual. You start to blame just circumstances when there is a bigger war behind it. You begin to make decisions based on fear rather than revelation. This is exactly why Paul writes that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and spiritual forces of wickedness. This is not poetry. This is diagnosis. Paul is revealing that there is a structure, a hierarchy, an invisible system operating against the will of God and against those who belong to Him. In other words, the spiritual battlefield is not messy. There is intelligence there. There is a strategy. There is organized opposition. And if there is organized opposition, then there is also an organized response from God. This is where the angels enter. Many people have a childish view of angels, as if they were just decorative figures from the sky, as if they were symbols of peace, as if they existed only to bring emotional comfort. But the Bible shows angels executing orders, bringing messages, guarding God's servants, opening prisons, wounding enemy armies, and acting in scenarios of real spiritual confrontation. Angels are not heavenly ornaments. They are agents of the kingdom, messengers, guards, executors, warriors. They do not act independently of God. They do not operate out of sentimentality. They are not moved by human superstition. They respond to divine authority. And this is important because the spiritual battlefield is not a duel between equal forces. There is no balance between light and darkness, as if good and evil were on the same level, competing on an equal footing. No. God is sovereign. It always was. It always will be. Darkness does not rival God in absolute power. They resist, they attack, they try to influence, they try to delay, they try to destroy. But they remain limited before the authority of the Most High. So why does the battle exist? Because although God is sovereign, He has established a real spiritual dynamic in the relationship with humanity. Decisions matter. Obedience matters. Prayer matters. Alignment matters. And this is where many get confused. They think, if God wants to protect me, then nothing else matters. But the Bible does not teach spiritual passivity. She teaches vigilance. Jesus said, "Watch and pray." Peter warned, "Be sober and vigilant." Paul talked about armor. All of this points to a clear reality. The Christian was not called to live in panic, but neither was he called to live distracted, because spiritual distraction is expensive. A distracted person doesn't notice patterns, does not notice open doors, does not perceive contaminated environments, does not notice repeated attacks in the same areas. And the enemy loves cycles. If he realizes that the same strategy always brings you down, he will insist on it. That's why some lie trapped in patterns that seem endless. Always the same fall, always the same weight, always the same confusion, always the same coldness. Many people call this personality, but sometimes it's war. Many people call this a phase, but sometimes it's a siege. Many people call this chance, but sometimes it's invisible opposition. And it is in this scenario that the actions of the angels become even more impressive. Because while you only see the surface, God sees the entire map. You see the difficult day. God sees the war behind the day. You see the delay. God sees the invisible resistance. You see a closed door. God sees the deliverance that this door hid. You only see the pressure. God also sees the angels supporting you in the midst of it. Does this mean that all difficulties are spiritual? No. It would be superficial to say that. There are natural consequences, wrong decisions, emotional exhaustion, real-life problems. But the opposite era is also dangerous, reducing everything to the natural and completely ignoring the spiritual. This imbalance is blinding, and a spiritually blind person becomes easy prey. That's why you need to understand the battlefield, because when you understand the field, you stop interpreting everything shallowly. You realize that there are times when what is at stake is not just your mood, your performance, or your routine. It's your clarity, your faith, your authority, His constancy with God. And the question is no longer just, why is this happening to me? The question becomes, what is being fought for in me? This question changes the reading of your entire life. Because maybe what's being attacked isn't just your peace. Maybe it's your prayer. Maybe it's not just your energy. Maybe it's your spiritual focus. Maybe it's not just your emotions. Maybe it's your ability to stay faithful, firm. And when you understand this, you begin to realize that this invisible war does not happen randomly. She has standards, it has targets, it has triggers, it has answers. And in the next block, we'll get into exactly that. How this spiritual conflict expands in practice, how angels operate within this invisible war, and why some battles seem to last much longer than you imagined. Now that you understand that there is an invisible battlefield, we need to move on to an even deeper question. How does this war happen in practice? Because it's one thing to know that it exists. Another thing is to understand how it manifests itself, how it develops and why. At certain moments, it seems that there is spiritual pressure concentrated on specific areas of your life. And here's the first point that a lot of people don't realize. Spiritual battles rarely begin with noise. They start with infiltration. Before there is a crisis, there is often a suggestion. Before there is fall, there is wear. Before there is visible confusion, there is a small invisible distortion. This is how smart wars work. First, The enemy tries to alter your perception, then it weakens your resistance. Then normalize what should alarm you, and only then does he expand the siege. This is why not every spiritual battle seems dramatic at first. Sometimes it starts with a coldness that you can't explain, a constant distraction, a prayer without strength, an unusual irritation, a repetitive discouragement, a sequence of thoughts that push you away from the truth. Everything seems small at first. That's the problem, because what is too small to scare is often big enough to contaminate. And it is exactly at this point that many people lose the war without realizing it. Not because she was defeated in a big confrontation, but because he ignored small movements. In the Bible, we see this very clearly when the text shows that Satan is a liar, accuser, and strategist. He works with distortion, pressure, and insistence. He doesn't need to start by bringing you down completely. Often, it is enough to weaken you little by little. Just interrupt your communion. Just occupy your mind. Just tire your soul until you become spiritually sluggish. Slow to discern, slow to react, slow to obey, slow to realize what is being set up. And while this happens, heaven is not inactive. That's a powerful detail. Many people live as if, in the face of battle, there were only two things: them and the problem. But the Bible shows a much more complex reality. There is divine response in motion. In the book of Daniel, one of the most impressive revelations about this happens. Daniel prays, fasts, seeks understanding, and when the answer finally arrives, the messenger reveals something shocking. From day one, the prayer was heard. From day one. But there was resistance along the way. There was spiritual opposition. There was a confrontation until Miguel entered the battle. Stop for a moment and think about the weight of this. The prayer had been heard. The answer had been released. But there was war on the way. This destroys a superficial idea that many carry. The idea that if something is taking time, then God hasn't heard it. Not necessarily. Sometimes delay does not mean absence. It means battle. Sometimes silence doesn't mean rejection. It means that there is an invisible movement that you cannot yet see. And this completely changes the way you interpret time-consuming processes. Because maybe what you called abandonment was spiritual resistance. Maybe what you called delay. It was a confrontation in the invisible. Maybe what you called God forgot me. It was a war happening in dimensions that your eyes cannot reach. Now understand, this does not mean living blaming the spiritual world for every delay, but it does mean recognizing that there is more going on than meets the surface, and angels appear precisely in this environment of response, protection, and war. They are not just spectators of God's plan. They participate in the execution. When Peter was in prison, the church prayed, and an angel was sent to take him out of prison. When God's people needed direction, angels appeared with messages. When heaven wanted to demonstrate protection, the sacred text showed angels camping around those who fear the Lord. See the logic of this? Prayer, alignment, response, spiritual movement. There is a connection here. Angels do not move at human whim, but within God's order. And within this order, the spiritual life of the believer matters. This is why prayer is not just a religious habit. It's war positioning. When you pray, you are not just speaking nice words. You are aligning yourself with the sky. You are declaring dependency. You are reaffirming who Gia dominates your life. You are placing yourself under an authority greater than any invisible opposition. Prayer is not a weak ritual. Prayer is a spiritual signpost. She says, I know who I trust. She says, I'm not going to interpret everything just by the flesh. She says, even without seeing, I'm still standing. And this matters because spiritual warfare also involves legality, access, and alignment. Think like a court. Not every battle is just brute force. Many involve prosecution. The enemy accuses, condemn. It tries to explore guilt, loopholes, unaddressed sins, persistent disobedience, pride, bitterness, wrong alliances, contaminated environments, not because he has sovereign authority, but because he tries to operate where he finds space. This is why the Bible insists so much on repentance, holiness, watchfulness, forgiveness, and obedience, not as religious weight, but as a spiritual strategy. A misaligned life creates noise. A divided life loses its clarity. An unsupervised life opens doors that the person himself later doesn't understand how they were opened. And here is a point that few have the courage to say clearly. Not all oppression comes because a person did something terrible. Sometimes she was just vulnerable by remaining distracted. Distraction is dangerous because it seems harmless. You will relax. Keep tolerating it. You get used to it. Negotiate small concessions. Let the flame subside. And suddenly, what used to bother you starts to seem normal. This is one of the most dangerous signs of an expanding battle. When a person's spiritual environment changes and they no longer notice it. She loses sensitivity, loses hunger for God, loses clarity, loses reaction strength. And at this point, the war has already advanced a lot. But there is powerful news here. The advancement of war does not mean that you are defenseless. On the contrary, when God opens your spiritual eyes, you stop fighting in the dark. You start to identify patterns, understand cycles, understand why certain attacks recur, discern what once seemed like chaos, and above all, learn to cooperate with what God is doing in the invisible. This cooperation changes everything because the spiritual battle is not won by panic, not for mysticism, not even for empty phrases. It is faced with truth, vigilance, prayer, word, obedience, and firmness. This is how you get out of the position of someone who only gets beaten for someone who discerns. And discernment is crucial because there are short battles, but there are also long battles. There are quick confrontations, but there are also persistent resistances. There are immediate answers, but there are also processes that heaven is working on while you still don't see anything changing. And this is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of the invisible war. Remain firm when the visible has not yet caught up with what has already begun in the spiritual. This is where many give up. This is where many weaken. It is at this point that many misinterpret the silence, delay, and pressure. But in the next block, we'll get into the deepest part of all. What's really behind these drawn-out battles, who the central targets of this invisible conflict are, and the big revelation that almost no one notices about why certain attacks focus squarely on you. Now we come to the most sensitive point, and also the most revealing of this entire message. Because up until now, you have understood that there is an invisible war, understood that it happened strategically, understood that angels participate in this dynamic. But there is still one question that changes everything that needs to be answered. Why do certain battles seem to choose you? Why are there areas of your life where the pressure is disproportionate? Why are there cycles that insist on returning? Why are there attacks that appear personalized? Here is the revelation that few see. Not every battle is about what you did. Many are about what you carry. This completely changes the perspective because there is something in you, a potential, a calling, a spiritual position that the invisible world recognizes before you even realize it. And that's why attack often comes before clarity. Before you understand who you are, there is already opposition trying to confuse you. Before you take your position, there is already resistance trying to stop you. This is not random, it's strategic. In the Bible, we see this repeatedly. Before great moves of God, great confrontations arise. Before the liberation of a people, oppression arises. Before the manifestation of purpose, an attempt at destruction appears. Before someone takes a stand, pressure arises to give up. Because the enemy doesn't just react to what you've done in the past. It tries to stop what you can become in the future. And this explains why some battles seem disproportionate. It's not because you're weak. It's because there's something valuable being protected and also being attacked of. Now, understand something profound. The main target of spiritual warfare is not just to make you suffer. It's stopping you from staying. Stay in faith. Stay in the truth. Stay aligned, remaining firm when everything around you tries to take you off track. Because whoever remains grows, and whoever grows advances, and whoever advances makes an impact. And that is exactly what the kingdom of darkness tries to interrupt. Therefore, the attack often does not only come in the form of pain, it comes in the form of distraction. Because a distracted person doesn't stay. It wavers. It starts and stops. It cheers up and cools down. She decides and backs off. She takes a stand and then negotiates. And this spiritual instability is extremely explored in the invisible war. Now think about your own life. How many times have you started something with God and suddenly lost your rhythm? How many times have you felt clarity and soon after came confusion? How many times have you decided to change and what exactly pulled you back appeared? This is no coincidence. This is targeted resistance. And here comes one of the most important parts of this revelation. The spiritual battlefield is highly personalized. Not in the sense that everything revolves around you, but in the sense that the attack points are targeted. The enemy does not use the same strategy for everyone. He observes patterns, exploits recurring weaknesses. Take advantage of untreated wounds. It amplifies lies you've started to believe. If he realizes that rejection destabilizes you, he will use it. If he realizes that anxiety is paralyzing you, he will press on it. If he realizes that guilt keeps you away from God, he will insist on this accusation. Why? Because he doesn't need to invent a new strategy if the old one is still working. And this is serious, because until you identify the pattern, you continue reacting in the same way. And reacting in the same way keeps the cycle active. Now comes the strongest part. If there are strategies being used against you, so there are also strategies available in your favor. And here is the point that many ignore. Angels don't just fight in a generic way, they work within specific assignments. Just as there are levels of opposition, there are also levels of response. Remember Daniel? There wasn't any resistance, and it wasn't just any answer. There was a specific battle and a specific intervention. This shows that the spiritual world does not operate improvised. There is organization, there is direction, there is purpose. And this means that when God moves in your favor, it is not at random. There is precision, there is shipping, there is coverage, there is intervention at the right time. But here's the key that many miss. You may be being helped and still not realize it, because you're waiting for the answer to come in a specific way. But God is acting in another way. You ask for immediate change. God begins by strengthening you from within. You ask for a quick exit. God sustains you in the process. You ask for the problem to go away. God gives you the ability to remain firm even with the present problem. And meanwhile, in the invisible, angels are at work, protecting, barring, redirecting, sustaining. But as you don't see, you think nothing is happening. And this is one of the biggest mistakes. Visible silence does not mean invisible absence. Now, here is the revelation that closes this block. Many battles you face today are not just about today. They are connected to something bigger, with growth, with maturity, with positioning, with spiritual authority. Because God is not just interested in getting you out of problems. He is interested in forming in you someone who will remain steadfast in any scenario. And that requires process. It requires resistance. It requires perseverance. It requires faith that does not depend on what you see. And it is exactly in this environment that the war intensifies. Because while God works in you, there is opposition trying to stop this development. Now the question changes again. No longer, why is this happening to me? Now it is, what is God forming in me in the midst of this battle? This question takes you out of the victim position and puts you in the position of someone who discerns purpose. And when you discern purpose, you stop wasting the battle. But all of this still leads to an extremely practical point. Because knowing that there is war, knowing that there is strategy, knowing that there is action by angels, still does not resolve a fundamental issue. What should you do practically within this invisible battlefield? And that's exactly what we're going to reveal now. Knowing that there is an invisible battle is important, but it's not enough. Because discernment without positioning becomes just information, and information alone does not win war. So the question is now straightforward. How should you practically live within this spiritual battlefield? The first answer is this. You want to stop living on automatic. Most spiritual defeats do not happen due to a lack of love for God. It happens due to lack of vigilance. A person loves God, but get distracted, believe, but relax. Hear the truth, but it does not support the practice. And spiritual warfare does not mix with distraction. Those who live distracted take a while to realize when their mind has started to be attacked. It takes time to realize when peace has been replaced by oppression. It takes time to realize when small concessions open big gaps. That's why Jesus said to watch. Watching is not living in fear. It is living with perception. It's noticing what's trying to steal your peace. It's identifying what weakens your communion. It is realizing which environments, habits, content, and conversations push your soul away from the presence of God. Not everything that enters your routine enters neutral. Some things contaminate. And this is where the real application begins. Protect the spiritual environment of your life. Just as in a war you protect territory, in spirit you need to protect access. Access to your mind, access to your heart, access to what shapes your thoughts, because what feeds your mind strengthens something inside you, or strengthens your faith, or strengthens the confusion, or strengthens peace, or strengthens anxiety, or strengthens the truth, or strengthens the lie. This is why the Word of God is not optional in times of battle. She is a weapon. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he did not respond with emotion. He didn't respond with despair. He did not respond with a personal opinion. He responded with word. This is very deep because it shows that on the spiritual battlefield, it is not enough to feel. It needs to be signed. A mind without words becomes vulnerable ground because any voice sounds true, any thought seems yours. Either accusation seems fair, but when you know the truth, you begin to dismantle lies with precision. You stop accepting all blame. Stop agreeing with every accusation. Stop calling identity what was just an attack. Now, in addition to vigilance and the Word, there is another central point. Constant prayer. Not mechanical prayer, not empty repetition. Prayer as alignment. Because those who pray don't just ask. Who now takes a stand. In prayer, you recalibrate your soul. In prayer, you remember who God is. In prayer, you weaken the noise and strengthen spiritual perception. And often prayer doesn't just change the scenery around you, it changes you within the setting. It makes you stronger, clean you up, wakes you up, realign you. And this is essential because there are battles that are not won in a single intense moment, but constantly. To remain praying, in remaining obedient, in remaining firm when nothing seems to change. Another decisive point is this: don't fight alone. One of the enemy's most dangerous strategies is isolation. He tries to make you believe that no one would understand, that your war is yours alone, that your weight needs to be hidden, that asking for help is a sign of weakness. But prolonged isolation weakens. The Bible shows body, communion, intercession, spiritual support. There are battles where you need mature fellow believers, sincere prayer, and wise counsel. This does not replace your spiritual responsibility, but it prevents you from fighting without cover. There is also an application that many ignore. Obey quickly. Because sometimes a person wants to rebuke the enemy, but continues to fuel disobedience, want peace, but maintains practices that produce confusion, want freedom, but protects what God has already ordered to abandon. This doesn't work. There is no healthy spiritual warfare without practical alignment. Obedience closes wrong doors. Repentance removes weight. Forgiveness breaks emotional chains. Resignation clears the ground. Many people want victory without cleaning, want relief without transformation. But God doesn't just want to alleviate symptoms. He wants to treat roots. And here is a final, extremely important application. Learn to remain. Not every battle ends quickly. Not every response will be immediate. Not every confrontation will disappear the moment you realize it exists. But staying changes everything. Remain without negotiating the truth. Remain without abandoning prayer. Remain without giving your mind to the lie. Remain until the visible meets what God has already begun in the invisible. Because there are times when your biggest struggle won't be screaming. It will remain firm. And that brings us to the strongest point of all. Because after vigilance, the word, prayer, obedience, and permanence, there is a final truth that needs to be engraved in your soul. You're not just trying to survive a battle. You are being called to win in it. And in the climax of this video, I'll show you why this invisible war was never just about taking you down, but about revealing who remains standing when heaven decides to fight for him. Now, everything converges to this point, because after understanding the battlefield, to discern the patterns, to perceive the invisible action, to learn how to position yourself, there is a truth that completely changes the way you see this war. You were never fighting alone. Never. Even on days when you felt silence. Even in moments when it seemed like nothing was happening. Even when his strength seemed at its limit. There was movement in the invisible. Angels being sent. Resistance being faced. Attacks being blocked without you noticing. How many times have you thought it was just a difficult day? But was it actually a deliverance? How many times have you thought you were losing, but was God supporting you? How many times have you felt weak, but it didn't fall? This was no coincidence. That was war. And here is the most powerful point. Proof that God is fighting for you is that you are still standing. Even after everything, even with pressure, even with confusion, even on difficult days, you're still here. And this reveals something that the invisible world has already noticed. Before you even understand, there's something in you that won't give in, something that remained, something that resisted, something that continued even when it would have been easier to give up. And this is exactly what activates the sky. Because God doesn't look for perfect people. He looks for people who stay. People who, even without seeing it, continue. Even without feeling it, they continue. Even without understanding everything, they continue. And when someone decides to stay, the sky moves even more intensely. Angels are not sent to those who give up everything under any pressure, but for those who choose to stand. And maybe today you don't need a new answer. Maybe you need a revelation. You are not being destroyed. You are being sustained in war. And that changes everything. Now you understand. That heavy feeling, it wasn't just tiredness, that sudden confusion. It wasn't just a random thought. Those days when everything seemed stuck, they weren't just coincidence. There is a battlefield. There is an invisible war. And more important than all that, there is a God who did not leave you alone inside it. But here's the question you need to answer truthfully. How will you live from now on? Will you continue to ignore the signs? Are you going to continue treating everything as if it were just natural? Are you going to continue living automatically, distracted, vulnerable? Or will you take a stand? Because now you know. You know that your spiritual decisions have weight. You know that your vigilance changes the environment. Know that your prayer activates alignment. Know that your stay sustains you in the midst of war. And mainly, know that there are angels fighting while you decide to remain. So don't waste this revelation. If this video opened your eyes, I want to ask you something simple but powerful. Right here in the comments. I am not alone in this battle. That's not just a sentence. it's a positioning. And when you declare this, you are reminding yourself and reaffirming to heaven that you understand. Also, share this video with someone who is going through a difficult phase, someone who perhaps is interpreting everything wrong, thinking they are alone, thinking they have already lost. You can be the bridge to awaken that person. And if you want to continue understanding how the spiritual world really works, if you want to learn to discern better, strengthen yourself, position yourself, subscribe to the channel, because here you won't receive superficial answers. You will begin to see what most have never seen. And remember this: war can be invisible, but the victory of those who remain will always be real.